Awesome. Okay.
Good.
All right. So, hey, everyone. I'm here with Shadow, and we decided to do another conversation, another podcast for you all to listen to and enjoy. So, Shadow, if you want to say hi.
Hey guys, I like super excited for this. Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot, Nexus, for the invite. And I think this is gonna be a great conversation. We always tend to have pretty productive and insightful conversations, so it's good.
Oh yeah, that's true. I
Yeah.
mean, you were mentioning last time that you don't get to encounter too many people who actually like know about the same stuff as like Jungian psychology
Mhm.
and related things. And same thing with me. I don't get to have too many conversations about it because it's not like a normal mainstream thing that comes up. But whenever it does, it always proves to be a very fruitful conversation. We talked like was it last week or a couple weeks ago?
Yeah.
Um, and talked about a whole bunch of different things. And one of the things that came up is the fact that recently I became a therapist, and you've been a therapist for a while now. And so one of the things we talked about is how we've been applying Jungian theories to our work. Um, and I don't think so. We can't go. I guess if we talk about clients, we can't get too much into detail about who they are. But I guess we could talk about like the gist of what's going on.
hmm
So yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about your work as a therapist? How long you've been doing it? What you enjoy about it, and to what extent you've been able to apply Jung's theories to your work?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we were having this conversation last week where the aspect of encountering a therapist, a good therapist, is rare nowadays.
Mhm.
But encountering a therapist who kind of understands Jung to a fairly well degree where they can integrate some of the conceptual ideas or perhaps even like practical things that they can derive from Jung's concept into clients where they see differences in their whether it be behavior or like even temperament or the way of life or how they perceive certain issues in their life is very rare. So
Mhm.
it's really not only exciting, but it's quite encouraging to see that there's other therapists who have similar mindsets. So it's nice that way. And then in relation to applying to clients, we were talking about the last time where Jung is one of those people where he doesn't really give you instructions on how to apply his theories. He
Mhm.
just gives you it's like here's my genius. Take it how you will. I'm not gonna tell you how to do anything. So it's quite interesting that way. I did mention one incident where we're talking about the anima and animus and the conceptual idea of like the masculine within a female and the feminine within a male, and that's been something that's been on my mind for a very long time. I'm quite like attracted to the idea, just especially because you can see it overtly displayed objectively if
Mhm.
you pay very close attention. I mentioned to you one client where uh, she came to me from the consultation addressing issues of or concerns of anger concerns, right? And it was
Mhm.
more of in relation to interpersonal relationships with her loved one as well as more specifically her husband. And as I was speaking to her, if you pay very close attention to clients, you can kind of it's almost like spiritual in some sense. It's almost like the anima like possesses them or
Mhm.
like the animus possesses them and the masculine side kind of possesses them and it comes out in very like unique way. So the client might be talking about her daily life and there might be a trigger or something that I say where she might be a bit argumentative or roll her eyes or kind of like change her posture where these theories, these ideas that Jung brings on, it's very displayed, but you just have to be very well aware and acknowledge it being present. And once you acknowledge it, you can kind of work with the client to address it. Also, we
Mhm.
also talked about something else, which is very important because sometimes clients might come and you can't just sit there and be like, oh, this is the anima in you or like the animus, and they'll be like, what the hell are you talking about? So,
Mhm.
So you have to reframe it in different ways where they kind of understand it, but at the same time, you still have to have this background information about what exactly it is in its core, right?
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of is of one client that I have who has OCD, and the way her mind works, the way her unconscious mind works, how it produces these images spontaneously, and I knew it to be the activity of the anima within her, but I can't be like, well, it's like this feminine woman inside your mind that's like
hmm
we're taking these different elements and then giving you an image because that would just sound so alienating and jarring. So yeah, we have these theories in mind. We have them we have them in mind when we interact with clients, but it's rare to actually like bring up the concepts because usually it's not necessary. Or we can even talk about these concepts in a kind of shallow way. So the way I went about it with this client was I said like your unconscious mind does have this function which kind of just throws images together. So she has a lot of intrusive thoughts that are random, very chaotic, very taboo is the way she would put it. About things that she doesn't want to think about. And so she thinks to herself, like, why is my mind just generating these images? And so the way I framed it is, and again, there's a lot of different theories, psychological theories you can apply to it. What I'm noticing in psychology is that you'll find the same theory described using different words. And this person is like thinking to themselves, wow, I'm such a genius. Like I discovered this new thing, but really somebody else discovered it. They just described it differently. And so I describe this function within their minds that kind of just creates images, that just takes a bunch of different, like it fires in like a random way neuronally to just spontaneously produce an image. And it's like, what about this? It just kind of presents it to the conscious mind. And I told her it's a very fantasy-like behavior. It's very like childlike, and it shouldn't like reflect your deeper thoughts. And so kind of framing it in that way allowed her to kind of dissociate with it, kind of understand it. But then I also introduced the possibility that there might be symbolic content to these images that are coming to mind. Like it's not just it's not just random images. Like there might be something behind it, but then I told her how to interpret it. Like don't take it literally. Don't assume that it has a literal meaning, but it has more like a symbolic meaning. And she's into novels, so I explained it like, whenever there's like a hidden meaning behind a novel, behind like a story, you have to dig deeper to find what that is. And it could be the same case with these images that are popping to mind, but they're symbolic rather than literal. And so kind of framing it in that way has helped her to an extent, like treat those intrusive thoughts differently, and not associate with them, not believe that there's something wrong with her necessarily. Rather, it's just the unconscious being the unconscious. But to get back to the point that you were saying, I didn't frame it in terms of like masculine and feminine, which a part of me felt like doing. But like it would be weird to be like, there's an additional woman inside your mind doing this. Like it just sounds like a weird thing. And I deemed in that moment it not to be necessary to bring that up or frame it in that way.
It's the same thing for, I think, out of Jung's kind of theories, one of the easiest ones to integrate is the shadow. I think that is something that's a little bit more easier to integrate, just because you can frame it in a different way. You can even tell clients that this is almost like a different personality that you have, and they understand the word personality a little bit more than the aspect of a shadow, because like the way Jung talks about the shadow, it has like multiple layers of meaning, and you can't really go all the way to the end of it where you're talking about maybe like collective unconscious, or like some sort of archetypical form of the shadow, because the client's not going to understand it, right? Oftentimes using words which are related to psychology but also present. For example, like I had a client one time, there was a clear shadow self where she was a high kind of achieving female, and she had this idea of what a family should be and so forth, but her career was kind of at the forefront of what she was looking for in her life. And you could tell that her shadow side kind of quite literally just demanded a family to some extent, or having a child, or so forth. And integrating those things, you have to do it in a slow manner as well, where like you can't just be like to the client, yeah, this is your problem. Sometimes, even though it's kind of weird to say as a therapist, sometimes a client might come and you can immediately tell what the actual issue is to some degree. There's a little bit of bias to it, but for me, I think I have this, I don't know, I've seen like intuitively when a client comes to me and they share a little bit of things, I'm like, this is the issue, right? And it's sometimes, most of the time, it seems to be the issues. I don't know. I'm not trying to like boost myself, but even with the shadow, you can tell. But you have to walk the client through where they come to that own conclusion by themselves, and it's a lot more effective that way, right? Yeah, for sure. So, I would be curious to understand, like, have you ever had the opportunity to like explore the idea of the shadow with some of your clients?
Yeah, and I totally agree that it is like one of the more approachable ideas for a lot of reasons. And so when I introduce this idea, this is one that like people can pick up on easily,
Hmm.
because I think intuitively we sense it. Also, it's like it's in all media. It's like the most like immediately apparent type of archetype that you see, like the villain in a story, or like when somebody has like a demon. Whenever you see that trope of like an angel or a demon on somebody's
Hmm.
shoulders,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
they're like trying to get the person to do something, like so it's very relatable, and everybody gets it on that way. So I have applied it a couple of times. I have brought it up a couple of times, and in kind of different ways, and they're both interesting. So one person, he's dealing with addiction, with a porn addiction, and it's like he describes like, you know, like he's trying really hard not to use it, but then suddenly something overcomes him and just kind of like possesses his mind for a little bit, and then takes him down this dark path where he uses porn, and then after he's done, he's like, "What have I done?" Like he doesn't identify with that part of himself, and so kind of I framed it in terms of the shadow, like, you know, you have this higher self, these higher intentions, that which you associate with your ego, but then in the shadows, there's something else that's kind of opposed to your ego's intentions, and it comes up and it possesses you and it takes over, and then that's what happens in these states, when you're using porn. And he asked, interestingly, like, what do we do about this? It's actually a good question because I don't know 100% what to do about it. You know, he's like, do I just keep pushing that side away and like try to fight it? And sometimes, you know, you should fight it depending on what it is, because again, it's similar to like a struggle with a dragon where you do have to wrestle with it in order for your ego to get control if your ego is very weak. But you can't fight it forever because it is like a fundamental part of you. And so I talk more about like integrating it, like more like healthy sexual behavior that doesn't feel like crap, that doesn't feel addictive, or that it's like, you know, restraining you in fundamental ways. And so I talked about integration, and like he understood that, and and we made a plan to kind of go about integrating it. But again, it's a challenge, and I'm wondering, like, I mean, with respect to like that client or any other client, what do you recommend, or what do you think is a good way to deal with a shadow that's manifesting in that way?
I think like I agree with completely on the aspect of integration. I actually think that's quite important, and this is probably the answer. I do tend to rephrase it to my clients that, for example, I might tell my client that there's two different kind of personalities of you within your mindset, right? And one is trying to achieve something that is of a higher order, like you mentioned, and which is trying to strive for perhaps kind of like an ideal you to some degree. I think that's there. And then this other aspect where is, well, the shadow could be positive sometimes too. And you can rephrase it as a positive aspect too, where if you were able to tackle this shadow and to take control of it to some degree and to manifest it through some integration process, it actually helps you in relation to moving forward to that ideal goal that you have. So reframing it that way kind of helps sometimes because it's almost like a positive journey that you're going through where this integration will lead me to this path that I want to be or something that I see which currently my behaviors don't particularly match up to that, but if I do get the opportunity to integrate this it will, and that helps clients, that actually helps clients quite a lot just to reframe it, like because sometimes you can say the shadow to the client or express it to them and it seems like almost like a foreign kind of evil part of themselves, which it is sometimes, and you have to have like wording and the way to conceptualize it where the ego is not too kind of like shocked by the presence of it to some degree, and it helps integrate it in a healthy manner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
You know, whenever I explore the shadow, I've realized one of the benefits of exploring it is like when you realize that, like, you know, it makes sense for us to have it. Like, we're just human. Like,
Hmm.
it's not necessarily evil. It's just evil because we've defined a particular standard of good, and then all of the rest of ourselves that's incompatible with that gets deemed evil. But it's not inherently evil. It is just kind of nature. So I definitely could also frame it for my client in that way. You know, that and I do try to like frame it that it's not the worst thing. Like porn addiction, yeah, it's not great, but like there could be way worse addictions. Um, you know, speaking. But I did have another opportunity to apply the concept, and this one is a bit interesting
Hmm.
because actually I applied two different concepts in this one case, and the client was very receptive to it, and he really like enjoyed it, and that was one of the highlights that he mentioned when I asked for feedback. But basically, he gets into fights with his older brother, a lot. And his own personality, he's a very like driven person. He's very motivated. The client, he goes to the gym regularly. He's not lazy at all. Like he's always meal prepping. He's like pushing himself really hard to be like a good athlete, to work hard, all this stuff. Whereas his brother is like very lazy and just like sits in his room and plays video games all the time and doesn't get off his ass and just like, you know, wastes time and wastes his life. And so whenever my client sees that, he gets really infuriated, like really pissed off. And so I framed it in terms of like, well, you have this particular standard for yourself that you've set. like of being this very driven person, of being very motivated. And so when you see the opposite, when you see like that side, that side that's been pushed into the shadow, when you see it in somebody else, it gets triggered. So it particularly makes you mad when you notice it. So it's a case of shadow projection where like the side of him, and he used to be a pretty lazy person. He used to be like unmotivated as well. And it was only recently, actually, interestingly, it was because of a seizure. He had a seizure, and then this kind of just reoriented his life completely, and he's changed his life completely. And I'm like, you don't need a therapist, bro. You just need another seizure.
That's funny.
But yeah, so my guess was that he was projecting like his past self that he didn't like onto his brother, and then
Hmm.
whenever he saw those behaviors in his brother, it really pissed him off and triggered him. And so and this is actually an interesting case because having told him that like it's activating this part of your mind, he understood it. He's pretty smart, so he understood what that was going on. It made a lot of sense to him. And ever since then, in addition to a bit of other work, his relationship with his brother has like dramatically improved. Like they're playing video games together. They're like having a lot of fun. They're having good conversations with each other. Whereas
Hmm.
before it was very distant. And that was actually something I recommended. Because he wanted to help his brother because like his brother's not in a good place, drinking a lot, and wasting a lot of his life. And so I told him like, if you confront your brother, if you like get angry at him and like go with that, it's not going to do anything because people get defensive whenever somebody's attacking them. This is a big misconception that like you need to like be rough with somebody in order to shake them up.
Hmm.
Sometimes, like
Hmm.
it depends, but like really as therapists, we know that like you need to build a strong relationship with somebody and show that you care about them and that you're empathetic before you can produce change. Like that relationship element needs to be in place before change can be affected. And that's really kind of like the core of psychotherapy, I would say. Like one of the really key fundamental pillars is like that is the relationship. We talked about like Carl Rogers last time in the humanistic approach. And I would say like that's like the very essence of psychotherapy at the start, where it's just like you get to know somebody, you get to know who they are, you show them that you care, that you're interested in them, and that you're willing to listen to their concerns and and empathize with them.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you have thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think like we talked about it last time too, where uh the relationship is almost fundamental to
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapy. I actually think it's probably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a we were talking about well, what was his name? Irvin D. Yalom. He's a prominent psychotherapist
Mm-hmm.
and a psychiatrist as well in the field of counseling, and he talks about how the concept or the conceptual idea of the here and now, which we discussed last time, where sometimes the relationship is so profound that in addressing how the person is interacting with you in that particular moment and you building that relationship where the relationship is at the forefront of focus and you tweak their reactions to whether it be criticism or questioning or any type of judgment from you to them, they inherently get better outside of the therapeutic room, as the therapeutic room is kind of like a microcosm of a reflective piece for anything that they do in relation to their relationships outside, which is
Mm-hmm.
that's so cool. And even personally, like with clients, some I have clients where it's taking them a year of just slowly disclosing certain things to get to the main point. I actually,
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting. I actually had a client today about like an hour, like 2 hours ago, where it took her a year of just continuously seeing me on a weekly basis to disclose the main issue that she had to talk to me about.
Really?
And that's not to say I'm a shitty therapist. I could be a shitty therapist, but um but I think there was enough comfortability, and that event was so profound for her that she needed that trust and she needed that rapport building for that
Mm-hmm.
long of a time to disclose that. And a lot of times it has to do with like severe trauma or some sort of identity confusion. Like this event had, so just like a quick summary, the client had some sort of concerns in relation to using drugs, and she was very hesitant to disclose it because culturally that's not very accepted, as well as she self-criticized and judged her for so long that this was such a prominent thing to disclose, and she was very scared. And finally she disclosed it, and and the disclosure was so, it was very natural and it was very comfortable for her because
Mm-hmm.
of the relationship that you built, right? Sometimes therapists could like I said before, like sometimes clients might come in and I can identify the problem very quickly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you address the problem with the client because that could be very shocking for the client, and it might actually deter them from ever coming back. I had one
Mm,
client like that where, now that I think about it, that could have been the case because he came and we had a very intense first session, and that was his first ever session with a therapist ever, and he never showed up afterwards. And my
mm,
intention wasn't to bring forth a very intense session. He talks about he talked about the passing of a loved one, and now that I think about it, perhaps that could have been the case where the relationship wasn't built enough for me to have that conversation with them, and that might have actually
mm,
deterred them from even speaking to me about it. You know?
mm. And I mean, do you find that like I mean, I guess it varies from client to client, but I mean, how long do you think it takes to build that relationship? And like, I mean, 1 year sounds like a pretty long time for that client that you were mentioning before. But I mean,
Yeah,
I'm glad she stuck it out and then eventually got to that point.
yeah, yeah.
But do you find that like it takes a while, or like how does it, how does that relationship proceed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really depends on the client, and it also depends on a couple of things. Like first the client, first the circumstances of the client and what the
Mm,
client is going through, and then the relationship that you might have intrinsically with the client. So I'll explain all of that. Like it depends on the client because sometimes you actually just naturally have a good relationship with the client because of similarities, or you might have an interest in what they're talking about. So those micro kind of reactions to what they're saying and your interest just kind of get to them a little bit faster. So you build that
mm,
rapport very quickly, and you might just have similar temperaments. I think temperaments make quite a big difference. I have a client where we have very similar temperaments and we get along very
mm,
well, and it goes. And then the second thing is it just depends on the circumstances of the client. Like I had a few clients where um, this was the first time they had a very or somewhat of a positive relationship with a male figure as a therapist, right? So
mm,
that takes a very long time for them to disclose any type of thing because they're very hesitant.
mm,
Throughout their life, the representation of what is masculine could be completely negative, whether it be alcoholics or drug addicts or sexual abuse or like beating on people. You know what I mean? So those
mm,
things are intrinsically attributed to the masculine figure. So they see me and it just takes longer for them to even adapt to my speaking patterns, my questions,
mm,
how I'm talking to them, how I'm reacting to certain situations, right? And in that situation, it just requires a lot more empathy and patience on the therapist part. Um, so it really really depends on the client. It's cliche to say that,
mm.
but it truly does.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I can. So again, you're more experienced than me, and I've only been practicing since I think October, like
Mhm.
the beginning of October, and it's been kind of like ramping up, but kind of slow overall. Like on average, like 5 clients a week,
Mhm.
and then like over the recently it's been less because of the Christmas break, and yeah, people want to take a break and then start in the new year. But overall, my experience so far is I feel like I've been able to to reach clients pretty quickly, and like they trust me pretty quickly. And
Mhm.
I would honestly, not to like brag or anything, I would honestly attribute that to me being like trustworthy inherently. Like I do understand all of the crap that people go through, and I don't
Mhm.
like, it's a lot. People can go through a lot of stuff, and I've taken a lot of time to examine the kind of things people go through, because I'm not, because honestly my life has been great and like my child has been great and like everything has been like smooth sailing, so
Yeah.
I don't know like real adversity the way some people do. So I've taken the time to kind of like dig into that and see the kind of crazy stuff that people go through. I'm sure you've seen it as
Yeah.
well, in your law enforcement career and as a therapist.
Mhm.
But having taken that time, it's been able to like, it's been easy to empathize and reach people no matter where they are, no matter what their situation is, because all sorts of crazy things happen to people. But I had one case like where basically a client was transferred to me from another therapist. They had like 8 sessions with the therapist online, and then they wanted to do some sessions in person, and I was available for in person, so they transferred it to me. And yeah, first session went well. It was like very introductory, and we just kind of like got the main things down. And then the second session, and I asked him, can I read all your notes from the previous sessions to like get a sense of what kind of work you've been doing?
Mhm.
Um, and it's all been focused on CBT, on depression, on like various like CBT, techniques to deal with depression. And we should talk about CBT later because
Yeah.
that'll be an interesting thing
That would be
to bring
interesting.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's like that's like the core of the work that he'd been doing up until he saw me. Second session, he opens up about the situation with his parents, and like he tells me of like the history of conflict, like the marriage, like how it's affected him, like very deep, very heavy stuff. And I'm thinking the whole time, I'm like, wait a second, like none of this never appeared in any of your notes previously. And yet now it's like you feel like really opening up about it.
Yeah.
And I've noticed this my whole life. Again, like I'm not trying to brag. I'm just trying to state what my experience has been. That like people very much open up to me very easily.
Mhm.
Like and start telling me all sorts of things about their past and their life. And I'm usually very like safe with that information, or like they can sense that I'm safe. So I'm not totally sure what to attribute that to, but I'm just putting it out there that's been my experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think overall, I would say with my clients, it's um it it's not too difficult to get the client to open up
Mm,
on certain concerns, just because the client has an idea of how like therapy to some degree, right? They're coming in to
mm,
disclose something. Um, but there are a few clients where it takes a longer period of time because they know they have the idea and they know what the issue is and what they need to address, but they just can't do it because of some sort of internal fear or something. And
mm,
those are the clients that takes a very long time because you have to rebuild trust in them about whether it be a relationship in general, and you have to build that
mm,
trust in them, and then they will disclose it. But in relation to you telling me like temperamentally, I really, really do believe that sometimes there are. We talked about this last time too, where I do think to be a therapist, you have to have a temperamental inclination to it to some degree,
mm,
whether it be natural empathy or caring about people or the aspect of thinking a lot about how problems for people are and what are some of the solutions. I think those are very, very important just to have that temperamental inclination to whether it be care for someone or be a therapist. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was a big thing that we mentioned. Like these days, the market for therapists is getting really flooded.
Hmm.
And I do know that people have like a hard time finding the right therapist because of like personality mismatches. And like once you find the right one, it should be like pretty good after that. But like finding one is like a big challenge. But I agree in that like I think these days like a lot of therapists, and I'm talking again, I don't want to be mean to like the people in my program, but I'm talking about a lot of them in my program who don't seem to have the temperament for it.
Yeah.
Like they get the training, they get all the knowledge, they get the skills that way, but they don't have like the personality that where if you approach them, you can like sense that like this is a warm person and that like they care about you and that they trust you and like it's hard they for example like they don't show too much emotion in their face, their communication skills aren't super good,
Hmm.
and those are things that like take practice or they take the like right temperament. And so I think these things are a lot more important than just like learning the skills. But a lot of people are trying to approaching the profession as though it were just get the degree, get these lessons from this lecture, and I'll be good to go. But it seems
Hmm.
like a lot of it really depends on skills that are not you need practice to do, but you also need the right temperament for it.
Yeah, 100%. I like super agree with that, especially in relation to like some of the skills that you need as a therapist. Everyone has those skills. It's just a matter of perfecting it as well as presenting it in a way where it's empathetic and compassionate to the person, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
biggest things that therapists do, which a lot of people come to see therapists for, is to have someone sit down and listen to them in an understanding and empathetic way where they can reflect back what you're saying to you and help you kind of understand it. Everyone
Mm-hmm.
could do that to some degree. The point is, no one has ever felt that. Like there's some people who've never felt that in their life because
Mm-hmm.
people lack that type of communication skill or the ability to either put their biases aside or to put their entire identity aside to some degree for a period of time and then just listen to the person. We also talked a little bit about having some of the difficulties of being a psychotherapist is one, taking your own opinions and your own ideas or ideologies about life and people in general and putting that to the side when you're speaking to a client. That's one of the most difficult things for people. Like you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
in your classrooms, you see students who are trained to be therapists. I've seen them as well, where that is one of the key things I'll point out to them. We would have seminars where they would record themselves speaking to clients, and obviously the clients blurred out and things like that. But we'll have an opportunity to see the therapist in action, quote unquote. Um, and I would know immediately, like when the client presents some sort of issue, whether it be about like domestic abuse or like them having a differing opinion that's very conservative or liberal, the therapist has a reaction that is not a therapeutic reaction, but rather a reaction
Mm-hmm.
in their personal life, right? They'll
Mm-hmm.
be like, oh, it's almost like you're offended by the client's opinion about something. And that is the worst trait for a therapist because it breaks rapport right away because you're just like
Mm-hmm.
any other person on the street, right? They're not paying money to see some random person on the street. They're paying money to see someone who's trained to be empathetic, trained to communicate very well, putting aside their own opinions and ideologies. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point, and it reminds me of like I don't know if you can tell me if this is like the right or wrong thing to do in this case, but
Hmm.
it reminds me of two clients who are very like polar opposites. And one guy, he's dealing with a lot of issues related to his sexuality, and I always make a point to like ask about spirituality, ask about religion in our sessions. And he like told me like he hates the church, like he hates like organized religion and what it stands for. And in that moment, I was like, yeah, dude, screw them. Like not really like I didn't explicitly say that, but like I just smiled and said, yeah, it makes sense from your perspective because from his perspective, it did make sense. And then I have another client who's Muslim and very religious, actually more like very open with religion, but also very religious for her specific religion. And that's one of the things I studied at my school, Islam specifically. And so I felt very equipped to like talk with her about spiritual matters, about God, about prayer, about like the benefits of going to the temple, sorry, not temple, to mosque. And so in that case, I was very much like on board with her religion. Whereas another case, a guy who was an atheist, I was very much like almost I don't know. I don't want to say like I was against religion in that context, but like I didn't make it known or I didn't make it obvious that like my personal opinions on religion are actually more positive. And so in that moment, I felt like I was able to bracket, but I am worried about the case where it becomes difficult to bracket, where like I hear an opinion that like really like makes me go like sense that disagreement. Have you ever had like an instant like that where a client told you something
Yeah,
and like
100%.
you felt like disagreeing? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all the time. I think your example is actually quite great because it's almost like the antithesis of what that is, which is religion. So it's like that's a very strong opinion for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people. So I think what you did there is like I don't see any problematic issues with that. I do keep myself very consciously aware of who I am as a person and what is truthful to me. So sometimes
Mm-hmm.
clients might say things like, I hate men, or they might say things like general statements about certain things. And my first instinct as a therapist is like, you're saying that for a reason. Those words came out for a reason. So my inquiry or like interest peaks because not because of my personal opinions about men or the ideas or ideologies surrounding that. It's more of like, you said that for a purpose, and if we kind of talk about the purpose, we're more likely to come to the conclusion or some sort of solution to the problem at hand. So I'm thinking of it in framing it in that manner. So for example, like your example of the religious aspect, I would my first thought was like, okay, like why do you hate religion so much? Like what is the purpose of that? Like what does that serve for you? What has that done? Is that perhaps that's the shadow? Perhaps there's something, some sort of aspect there where if we do explore it, we could get to something else that is more closer to the problem at hand, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of it in that manner. I think that's useful as a therapist. It's very rare. Like I don't really get offended. Like I think
Mm-hmm.
a mass murderer could sit in front of me and I would not get offended. I think it would just be like, interesting. I'm more curious about it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's a level of curiosity that you need as a therapist. I think that deters. That's actually really good. I never really thought about that. Like curiosity deters your bias to some degree because bias is inherently like very strict opinions about something. But if you're curious, there's no really sense of bias, right?
That's an amazing point. And actually, during our training, our orientation for the practicum,
Yeah.
my CEO he did this weird presentation where he basically created a bunch of concepts using things like items from Legend of Zelda, from Ocarina of Time, and then like use them as like metaphors for like different things. So the Master Sword, like the main thing, was curiosity. Actually, like it
Oh,
represented
that's good.
curiosity,
Yeah.
and like he views curiosity as like the main thing that therapists should use. And you're absolutely right. Like it does deter like disagreements to a big degree because I'm recalling now like this isn't related to therapy, but rather when I worked at a different job.
Hmm.
And funny enough, I was while working at that job, I think I wrote one of my best videos on my phone. So whenever people see that video, I'm reminded of like the fact that I was working in like a factory during a night shift while writing that video. But that was an interesting place to work because I encountered a lot of people with very different opinions. And I knew one guy who um, his view it was during COVID, and like his view on COVID was, and again, this is controversial, like was what was it again? It was like that COVID didn't exist, I think. That like basically like what was happening was that people believed COVID existed and it was like through this placebo effect or whatever causing them to get sick. Okay. Now I thought that made no sense at all, but I was just like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me about that. And like, he just started divulging his opinions about everything. And like, he sensed that like I was on his side, but really I was just interested in how the hell this guy reached his opinion. And so there was no disagreement. And so, I mean, that's an example of exactly what you talked about, that just like curiosity can dispel that sense of being offended or that sense of disagreement, because you become like interested in like, okay, what's going on here? Like, how did this guy get to these thoughts? And so like, yeah, that makes absolute sense. And when you're saying that, it reminded me of a case that my friend took on, which was okay. Well, I'll be honest. I don't think he handled it in exactly the right way, but he's also learning and getting experience. So no, not too much fault on his part.
Yeah.
But he's Indian, and his client, and it was like his only client at the time, revealed, and it's kind of dark, so hopefully the YouTube censors don't take me out. This is long enough into the video that they won't detect it. But she was gang raped by a bunch of brown men. And she told him this, and he got offended, like like badly, and because he's a brown man, and like right away it makes him feel like somehow like he's associated with that. I don't know, but that's kind of like the thought that went through his mind. And the way he handled it was to like ask about the religion of those men, and then be like, "Oh no, they're Muslim. They're like they belong to a different group.
Oh, Jesus
not me,
Christ.
no, not me." Yeah, so probably not the right way to go about it, but like that's definitely a case where like you being the therapist like can get like triggered or like offended by what the client said, and then react kind of like spontaneously or defensively to not really address the issue, but rather to defend yourself. But like, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't think if I can't picture a worse reaction than that. It's gotta be the worst. Jesus Christ. Oh my God. That's so bad. That could, oh man. Oh man. I don't even know how to react to it. That's borderline malpractice. That's really bad. Yeah, I think yeah, I don't know how he identified with that. That's problematic that he identified with that. That's maybe there's some self-reflection that needs to go on in relation to that. I don't know how he identifies that, but yeah, like that is a good example of like to be a therapist. It's like it's probably, in my opinion, it's probably the best job in the world. It is you have to be very humble, and you have to know that you're very privileged to hear these stories, just because people share those things with only you, and they've never shared it in their entire life. Sometimes there's
It's an
people who are,
honor.
yeah, exactly. It's a big honor. Sometimes I have clients who are like 70 years old, and they tell me things that they've never told anyone in their life. Like they're on about to die, and they're telling me this. That's the biggest honor that you can get. So it's very, very. I'm very careful with my responses. Sometimes it might sound weird, but I've did it. I literally did this like 2 hours ago, where a client told me something and I did not know how to respond to it. So I literally told the client, I was like, "Give me 2 minutes to think. Let me think." So I just sat there for 2 minutes and I was thinking. I'm like going through my head, like, what are the type of responses that's appropriate? What is something that, like, if I say this, is it going to hurt the client? This, and this, and then I'll respond. That's 10 times better, and the client actually respects you, and the client feels that they're respected from doing that, than having an immediate reaction, which is very physiological and kind of like it's very having an immediate reaction to something shows me that you do not understand your unconscious to a degree that you should as a therapist. That's a very important thing to do, and it also shows that you may personally need some therapy, because if you're unable to, this is kind of a controversial thing. If you're unable to deal with some prominent traumas or prominent perspectives or ideologies that you have in your own life as an individual, and you're unable to like derive where these come from and really, really understand them to a core degree, it's very hard for you to be a therapist, because you're gonna hear a lot of things where people might have deterring views, right? Like, what if I'm brown and there's a dude who comes in and he's a KKK member and he's like super racist, right? Like, my first instinct is not to be defensive. I'm like, I don't care. Like, you hate brown people. It's like, cool. I'll just be like, okay, tell me about it. Like, what made you want get into this? What is your life like, right? Try to understand him. And like you said at the beginning of the video, that in itself is going to build way more of a difference than me getting offended. It doesn't really, it's actually very counterintuitive to be reactionary in that circumstance, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. That's awesome to hear. And I think you're absolutely right that like the therapist should understand their own unconscious to a degree. And like, I mean, that's one of the things that's like always recommended to us in our program. Is like, you need to be in therapy if you want to be a therapist. and it makes a lot of sense because even Jung said himself, like he seconded Freud's opinion that the analyst should also be analyzed,
Hmm.
and for good reason, because if they don't understand their own unconscious, they're going to run into problems like this, and even like problems of like imposing ideology or imposing like opinions on people.
Yeah.
And it's not it's I've noticed that like it's not bad to bring up opinions, but always to like preface it being like, okay, listen, this is just my opinion, this is just what I think, and I'm curious to see what you think about it, and then go ahead and state your opinion. And I've been
Hmm.
doing that with like a bunch, some of the, like the spiritual work, some of like the existential work, that's been coming up. But before I forget, I actually wanted you to. Last time you told me a story about a witch, and I wanted
Oh
you
my
to tell
God.
that story again because I think
Oh
the
yeah,
audience
yeah,
will
yeah,
find
yeah.
that really interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to make of it. This isn't even related to psychology, or I mean,
Hmm.
maybe it is, but
No.
if you want to go ahead and tell that story
No,
again.
100%. I think me and Nexus we were talking about this, and I brought up this story just as one. It's been on my mind for quite a long time because I don't know how to interpret it. I don't know what to make of it. Um, so the story goes is like I'm a therapist, but I also work in law enforcement as like a full-time position, and that's something I do. It's just something I'm passionate about, and I work as a therapist on my off days. And within my work in law enforcement, I have to deal with a lot of prisoners and things like that, right? And there's this one particular prisoner, and she was, let's say maybe she was like 55 years of age. And when you picture a witch, like what a witch looks like, the archetype of a witch, she looked exactly like that. Big nose, had like spots on her skin, not perfect skin. Um, Gray hair, like black hair with a little bit of gray inside. She's wearing like a kind of like a dress, like a witch kind of dress. Very skinny and long fingers as well. Um, and she was yeah, she just looked like the archetype of a witch. And she came inside and she came in and we she was arrested for I believe it was for staying inside of a household without it being her actual household. There's a criminal charge for it. I know it. I just don't want to say it right now. There's a criminal charge for it. She was arrested and she was brought in. One of the process that you go through after you've been arrested is you take pictures and fingerprints of every single person who has a charge, right? And she came in, and at that time, one of my jobs was to actually take fingerprints of her. And how the fingerprinting works is it's on a machine, and you have to take fingerprints of all your fingers, palms, and so forth. And it is I've never seen it. I've done thousands of people. I've done thousands of these cases. And how the fingerprinting works is when you put the print onto the machine, it indicates it as a white, yellow, or red. And white just means it's really good, no problems. Yellow means there might be some dissimilarities between the palm and the prints, and perhaps like the how the prints display on screen. It's clarity. And red just means it's you have to redo it. There's something like it just means either there's the print itself is too wet, so sometimes people get sweaty and you can't really get any of the print. It's kind of just a smudge, so it'll be red. Okay, and it's very common for some people to get like one or two yellows, one or two reds, and then you just do it again. You just take the print again and it goes away, no problem. And I have never in my entire life of doing this, I'm telling you, thousands of people, that at least 1,000 people it been red for multiple fingers. So I'm there and I'm doing the prints. A little bit of background: she has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So while she was in the jail cell, I was having conversation with her, and she was saying how she's seeing things. There's the devil is talking to her and so forth. She's talking like a witch, and she looks like a witch. So it's a little bit creepy. It's creeping me out a little bit. Um, and then so I take her outside. I'm holding on to her. We're walking to the printing machine, and she's still talking about a lot of these things. I have a bit of an understanding of schizophrenia at that time, so I do understand like just being engaging with her, a little bit empathetic, engaging with what's going on could be a little bit more helpful rather than just pushing her and doing the prints forcefully. So I'm doing that as she's right beside me. She's right here. I'm doing the print. So and then right before I take her hand and I put it on there, she looks at me dead in my eye and she says, they won't show on the machine. I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, the prints won't show. And I'm like, why? She's like, well, it's been cursed. It's not going to show. And I'm like, so in my head, I'm just thinking, I'm like, what is she talking about? She just has schizophrenia. Who gives a shit? It's gonna show. So I take the print and I do the thumb and it goes red. And I'm like, what the fuck? So I do each finger and I did each finger like 3 or 4 times. It's all red. So at the end of me completing all of the fingers, all of the palms and stuff. It's just a red screen, and I'm just like blown away. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? So my conclusion, and I was talking to Nexus about it, is it's either there was an actual curse on that, or there was some supernatural thing going because it is impossible. I've done thousands of people, and this cannot be a coincidence. And the entire time, I was just thinking about Jung and synchronicity, and I'm like, "Dude, what is happening? Like, there's no way this is real, you know? It just freaked me the hell out. But that was the story.
Dude, what the fuck?
I know, right? It was like super supernatural. I was like, holy shit, man. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you told me about this and being like, "What are your thoughts?" And I'm like, "Dude, you encountered a witch, just
yeah,
straight
yeah,
up."
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Like, I mean, did you ever say she was a witch, or did you just say it was cursed?
No, like I did not ask her about the witch or anything like
Mm,
that. But she specifically said she like the machine is cursed by the devil. I think she said the devil, it's cursed by the devil. It will not work. It won't take my prince. And I was like, I looked at her like, what are you talking about? Right? I
mm.
was just like, I didn't even pay attention to that. And then I did it and it just freaked me the hell out. And I just put her back into her jail cell. And I was just like, dude, I'm not dealing with this. This is too creepy.
So this person just doesn't have their prints on record.
Yeah,
Um,
they do. It's just all smudged. This is you can't even get anything.
right.
So it's just horrible. It was so like out of the ordinary. And my mindset at that time was just like, there is no explanation for this. And
Mm,
I was reading Memories, Dreams, and Reflection at that time too. And there was a specific chapter where Jung mentioned how he was in the house with his mother and his table just cracked and broke and I think a
mm,
spoon was just bent on his or like it snapped in half and he was talking about how when he did mention it to people it could have been just a coincidence or random things like that but he's like the statistical rarity of that happening is impossible and then also um that it happened in a meaningful way was very, very like prominent, and there's no way that
mm.
could be out of coincidence. There had to be some sort of meaning to it. And I was just thinking about that at the same time. It was interesting.
Right, right.
Yeah,
I would just straight up and say that that was a supernatural event
yeah,
that
yeah.
you encountered an actual witch. I mean, I've actually been interested in witchcraft. I used to joke about this, and I've been trying to infiltrate a witch coven to find out what they're all about. Again, this not like necessarily a psychological. I mean, okay, on one hand, there is like a psychological aspect to like the idea of a witch, of femininity, of like chaotic femininity. There's a lot attached there. But then it seems like in this case, like no, they actually have actual powers also,
Yeah,
and can
100%.
influence shit. But yeah, that's a crazy thing to happen, and like that's mind blowing. And like, I mean, I don't know if that's like your first encounter with like something supernatural,
I
because
think
even me, like with my synchronicity, like the synchronicities I experience, like not supernatural, they're just like very coincidental. It's like
mhm.
that's way too like coincidental for it to be like just a coincidence, but it's never like it never feels supernatural in that way.
Yeah. I think one other thing that just it's kind of cool how your memory just sparks in. It just literally just came into my brain right now, which is it was so I was born in Sri Lanka. I spent majority of my childhood there. I would say like till like 8 I was there. So I remember quite a lot and I remember going to this so I'm half Hindu and I'm half Christian just religious wise. So I grew up going to temple and church all the time. And there's some really beautiful churches in Sri Lanka. So I remember as a child my grandmother took me to a church and one of the things for the church at the church was you could buy candles, but they were like very big candles, like large candles that you can light up and put and just to pray. And the church it was a very big church. It was almost like a cathedral, and right at the top of it, where Christ was, there was candles there, right? And I remember specifically one of the candles falling. I think it fell and it just like spun around and it landed exactly straight while being lit in front of me, and I was just like.
Whoa.
And it's always stuck in my head, and I was just like, and I was a child too, and for some reason, I just like, it happened. I'm like, there's no way that's a random coincidence like that. That is
Mm,
impossible. Like, you know what I mean? That I think that was another supernatural thing that happened. Um,
mm,
and then in relation to like witchcraft and stuff, I've been super interested in that too. I actually recently watched a kind of like a podcast with a generational witch. She was maybe I'll send it to you later. It was actually quite
sure.
interesting. Her great great grandmother was a witch, and they just went on throughout her life, and she kind of
Mm,
deterred from that, and she went into Christianity, and she kind of learned about Christ and things like that, and she deterred that as part of like a demonic ritual, and she's more of the kind of idea that it's actually magic. Like you are doing things and you're cursing people, and there's consequences. So it was interesting. And I was also looking into. I've been recently. I don't know what you think about this. I've been recently into exorcisms and things like that. I've been
Mm,
watching a little bit more about that, and it's just again, it's just like that's not a coincidence. It cannot be a coincidence. Like
mm,
demons entering people and them reacting to, for example, like holy water or things like that, and like priests and exorcists talking about this and their experiences
mm.
at the Vatican and things like that. It's just like it just doesn't add up. This cannot be a coincidence, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah,
I find it interesting that you don't think of you think of that also in a supernatural way, because I mean I'm sure you've looked into it more than I have,
yeah.
but I don't know if you knew this, but Jung's very first like paper that ended up being published, which I think he wrote for school, was about exorcisms, and it was about how he provided a psychological explanation for how exorcisms work,
Hmm.
which later makes sense, which would later be formulated as like the whole shadow thing, and how like the basically the priest was interacting with this other side of the personality, the split personality, and
Hmm.
trying to well interact with it, but also like get rid of it in some way. So I find it interesting that you think that it's more like supernatural and not just psychological. Or I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
To be honest, I didn't even know that was one of his first papers. So perhaps like send it to me. I'll love to read it. Now that I
Mhm.
think about it, that could be an idea because if the personality itself, let's say there is a different personality and it's attributed to this kind of collective archetype of the devil and it has an understanding of Christ or the manifestation of Christ or holy water or things like that, it could react to those things when
Mhm.
presented, right? If a priest was to throw holy water onto them, it might just scream and run away. That doesn't make sense. That could be a possible explanation. But at the same time, there have been priests who've said they've seen supernatural events where it like
Mm.
divide, like it's impossible for a human being to do it, right? Like they might say things like this person levitated or something like that. So like my idea is like I could take that as one, it could be bullshit, right?
Mhm.
Two, it could be something that actually happened, or three, it could be a hallucination or like a collective kind of hallucination between the exorcist as well as the individual uh who's kind of embodied by this other personality as well, right? So
Mhm.
like, or it could actually have happened. So it's just, I want to learn the truth, but the truth
Mhm.
is so multi-factor that it's extremely hard, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I feel like, damn it, like if supernatural stuff is supposed to happen, it should have happened to me by now. Like, I'm very receptive to it. Like, I'm waiting for something crazy to happen. But it seems like I never encounter it. I mean, on the one hand, I do think, I mean, my opinions are changing on this. That like a lot is kind of supernatural already. Like I think consciousness is pretty supernatural. I think a life is pretty supernatural.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this is all related to like the work that I've been doing on like on biology and on psychology, in relation to emergence, and how like in some way like a lot of the phenomena in the world doesn't really make sense in terms of physics,
Hmm.
and so there are kind of like supernatural, but by supernatural we mean like even more beyond like the laws of biology or the laws of chemistry or whatever. But anyways, I wanted to discuss, or use this opportunity to discuss the schizophrenia case that I think
Oh
I
yeah,
told you about
yeah,
last
yeah.
time, because this one's really fascinating and it opens up like a whole window on how we could use Jung's theories to treat schizophrenia.
Hmm.
So it's a
Hmm.
very nice application of Jungian theory to schizophrenia. Like some of the more popular videos that I have are about the Jungian perspective on schizophrenia, and those ones get consistent views all the time. And people are always telling me like, "This is so helpful. This is so accurate. This describes my experience perfectly." But then it never like gives a clear way on how to treat it. And even Jung, if you read, in volume 3, it's like this, it's called the psychogenesis of mental disease. It's
Yeah.
all about schizophrenia, which at that time was called dementia precox. And then so in that, like in the forward, I think it says like, people might be wondering like why there's no like treatment methods for schizophrenia in here, and it's basically because it says, because like Jung was like, he first of all he couldn't think of any treatment methods, but then also like he was very interested in like just describing it, and so all of the focus is on like the description of what schizophrenia is like, rather than formulating a way to actually treat it. But like in there, it does seem like you can kind of wrap things together and think of a way to treat it, relating to, so for example, like in schizophrenia, the ego is very weak. And so anything you can do to strengthen the ego should help resolve some hallucinations and maybe make them give them less energy, because the ego, I mean, first of all, the ego is kind of like a hallucination. And so you're kind of powering this hallucination over the intrusive ones. And then things like, it would be similar to treating anybody with like any complex. like really everybody is kind of like on the schizophrenia spectrum. It's just on varying degrees. Because we all have like parts of our personalities that are autonomous and act differently. And it's all a matter of like identifying them, knowing what they are, and then trying to integrate them into your main personality. So I have one client who has schizophrenia. And interestingly, so I'm still a student. So like my CEO, like he showed me this case and was like, okay, are you sure you want to take this one on? And I read about it, I looked at it, and I was like, if I can't do it, nobody can. Because I feel like I was the one who was best equipped for this. And actually, when I was telling my supervisor about the case and describing it to him in a lot of detail, he was like freaked out. He was just like, okay, this is like really serious. You need to be really cautious. You need to like have numbers on hand. Whereas I was like, no, this is all good. Like I can handle this. It's all good. But the case basically is a Muslim woman who's been experiencing hallucinations since the age of 25, which is when they typically do onset. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but 25 is usually the age when they start. And they've been of a very religious nature. So she met her husband, and she heard the voice of God telling her that her husband was the Prophet Muhammad. And she believed it. She believed that her husband was a prophet, but he denied it. But, the voice of God was telling her otherwise, so she believed the voice of God. But then this voice would also tell her that her husband wasn't really her husband, that like somebody had shapeshifted into her husband and then was sleeping with her. And so she felt like her husband was just letting all of these men sleep with her, she described as very traumatizing. And she's had a whole bunch of different hallucinations, very kind of consistent, but also inconsistent in many ways, which is typical, but like some recurring ones. And when I met her, she was at this point where she understood she had schizophrenia. She'd been treated for it in a psychiatric facility. She'd gone to some counseling, but it wasn't super helpful. And she was on medication for it. So she was pretty stable overall. But recently, a hallucination was bothering her that came in the form of like this woman in her 40s. And this woman was nonverbal. She described her as being sick, which is interesting. And sick religiously, not like sick as in like physically sick or anything. And she would sexually assault the client, where like she would like basically stimulate her sexual organs. And she found this very distressing. She wanted the hallucination to go away. She would often scream at it, and her family members would see her screaming at it and like wondering what's going on. So I met her, and this was the case. And so I kind of explained how we go about treating schizophrenia in psychotherapy with the Jungian model. I didn't mention Jung. I didn't even like mention most of the concepts, but I basically explained that like this woman is a part of your mind. She's very much real. And she represents some part of you that has been split off from your main personality. And she was very receptive to this. She really liked the idea that like these were parts of her own mind, and that like they can be integrated back into her main self. I didn't make mention of the ego and how strengthening her ego could be a way to reduce the hallucinations. But my main focus was really about exploring what these hallucinations were, and kind of treating them seriously and like taking them seriously and like letting her know like, if you want, I can talk to your hallucinations and you can let me know what they're saying and we can have a discussion. I wanted to treat her hallucinations as though they were real, as though they were like legitimate parts of her psyche that could be dealt with, that could be interacted with, and could be like, brought into alignment with her main personality. So that's kind of how we approached it. So I started by kind of wondering what this hallucination could represent. And the kind of thing that I settled on was that it could represent her sexuality. Because she wasn't sexually active at the time. And it's possible that her sexuality had been repressed into this different hallucination that was taking form and then trying to stimulate her sexually in order to get her sexually active. And so I presented that interpretation, and she said that it made a lot of sense. It didn't fit fully. And this is where I encountered some kind of limitations of Jung's theory, because it did seem like the hallucinations were so complicated that they couldn't be reduced to like single archetypes or single things. Like there's something else going on, like a mix of archetypes, or like a mix of different like archetypal energies. But overall, like things have been really good. So, okay, I'll tell one thing that's interesting. During the session, the woman appeared. kind of unexpectedly. And then like just randomly during the session, the client was like, "Oh, by the way, she's here," and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"Who's here?" She's like, "Oh, the lady, the hallucination." I was like, "Oh, okay." What is she doing? Like
Mm-hmm.
in that moment, I was a bit like phased, but
Yeah.
but then I kind of snapped back into it. I was like, okay, so what is she doing? And like, what is she? How is she responding to what I'm saying? And she said that she's basically just sitting there, not doing anything. And I was like, okay. And this was a visual hallucination. It wasn't just auditory. It wasn't just a sense. But like, I kind of jokingly said, okay, well, hello, like, nice that you're joining us. And like, I kind of told her that I told the client that this woman is also listening to our conversation, and so might react in certain ways, and just let me know if she reacts in any way, and that'll give
Mm-hmm.
us some
Mm-hmm.
information. Um, but so basically, this has been the work that we've been doing. I've been also doing some work to strengthen her ego, give her more like self-esteem, so that would strengthen her ego. And like since then, the number of hallucinations have dropped dramatically. Like no hallucinations the subsequent week, no hallucinations after that. After that, I think there was like one incident where like they came for like 30 seconds and then disappeared. But overall, like hallucinations have gone down a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I asked her like, what do you think? What do you think that was about? Like, why do you think they've gone down? And she said, oh, the therapy's working. And I was like, that's interesting because I was honestly didn't have that much hope because it is a very difficult thing to treat. But this has given me the idea that like, yeah, Jung's theories can be applied to schizophrenia successfully, and actually allow a person to integrate these split off parts of their mind while also strengthening their ego. So yeah, like success there. I was very, very happy. It was a very, really great learning example. I'm still seeing her, so we'll see if things have have gotten better or gotten worse. But yeah, like a great opportunity to apply Jung's theories and like really great results. And so I was very happy with that.
Yeah, man. I think that's one of first off, amazing work because it's
Thank
it's
you.
it's it's quite rare that you see results that are so like profound in a quick manner. So that's amazing that you took the opportunity to put some of your knowledge into it. And it's actually quite courageous to take on a client that way, especially as you're training to be a therapist. So that's amazing work on you, man. That's awesome. Um, and then there's a couple of things that you mentioned, which is really, really important, especially in relation to schizophrenia too, because the perspective that therapists sometimes take, unfortunately, for schizophrenia is to kind of disregard hallucinations or psychosis periods and just focus on the ego or the individual themselves, and that like that does not help, and it's like a lack of understanding of schizophrenia itself. So I think Jung, like you said, understanding that perhaps it's within all of us, and this individual just has a collective unconscious or just like an unconscious that's very prominent rather than the ego. It's a good way to conceptualize that before interacting with the client, right? Like even you just acknowledging the presence of the personality or rather the hallucination there, that's such a cool dynamic because now you get to tell the client that, you know what, not only do I think that your reality is real, I'm willing to engage with it and make you feel kind of normal to some degree. And which is that's something that they never get within their life. And that in itself is probably such a like a healing method, you know? Um, that's super amazing. Like, yeah, that's really, really cool, man. And when you first told me, I was like, that's so cool. That's like it's amazing that you got the opportunity to actually experience that. That's such a cool thing, you know?
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I was very surprised, but then very happy. I was like, okay, like it gave me a lot of reassurance that like, okay, this can be applied. Like all of that information wasn't just theory. It wasn't just
Yeah.
information. It was actually like
Yeah.
useful. And you put into words a lot of what I was thinking as well. Um, that like acknowledging her reality and like acknowledging like a lot like right away I was very humanistic with it. I wasn't like like, oh, just ignore the hallucinations, they're not real. They're like, oh, no, they're very much real from your perspective. And like I was taking them very seriously. I wasn't
Yeah.
like shutting them away. And I think that's like the CBT approach, and we can get into CBT now, where it's like it's very cognitive focused. And so it's like reorienting. It's like ignore the hallucinations because they're not real. Like they're just kind of in your head. But
Hmm.
like, I mean, if they're popping up for a reason. Like they have their own agenda, they have their own desires, their own will. And so if you want to be a fully integrated person, you need to acknowledge what they want and then kind of like work to find a balance between what you want, what the ego wants, and what these hallucinations want.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas the CBT approach, and again, the CBT approach is I don't know, I've looked at the research a little bit. It seems like some success. It's definitely going to be successful in some ways. Like if, say, for example, if a person can't like these hallucinations are so bad that they can't get their life in order, it's like it'll help you get your life in order, but it doesn't really address the thing happening mentally. because you can't just tell a person like they're not real, because from their perspective, they're more real than anything else. Like there's nothing more real in a sense. And so telling them just like, no, don't worry, just ignore them is a very like inadequate way to approach their psyche. And I think it does relate to the fact that it is such a parallel experience to just having one ego and one internal monologue that's very alienating. Like I said, like my supervisor, when he heard, I explained all these details and he was freaked the fuck out. Like he was just like, okay, be really careful. Like worry about the children. She has kids too. Like make sure the kids are safe, make sure everything's safe. And I was kind of like, in that moment, I was kind of like taken aback. I was like, why are you assuming that she's dangerous? Like, why are you assuming that like she's like this evil person? Like, and I see why. It's because it's so alien, it's so different that it feels like this foreign entity. But really, she is a human. And like, if you've looked into the bicameral theory now, I would say like she has a mindset that used to be common in the past.
Yeah.
It's just that today it's completely incompatible with our modern way of thinking, with our modern consciousness. And so, approaching it with humanity and taking it completely seriously has worked so wonderfully. And like, she can sense that for me, that like I take her hallucination seriously. I'm not trying to talk down to her. And yeah, I mean, I hope things keep progressing. It's definitely a good one to keep learning from. And I can even keep you updated on like what's going on with that one.
Oh yeah, please. I think like 100% agree on the reality and taking the aspect of their reality very seriously as well. It's almost maybe perhaps that's not even a right way to conceptualize it, because for them that is reality. That is the reality. It's almost like me talking to you right now is my reality. For them, that is the reality. There's no difference. It's the exact same thing. And even Jung, like I remember reading something about like von Franz, and she had the opportunity to go have dinner with Jung or something, and they talked about one of the clients, and he mentioned that one of his client. She asked, "What is the client? Is the client on the what are some of her cases?" And he mentioned how the client is on the moon. She's not thinking that she's on the moon. She's actually on the moon. And she walked away like Jung is crazy. Like what is this guy talking about? But that's what he was trying to get at. It's just acknowledging the reality. And it's kind of interesting because I've had the opportunity to interact with individuals with schizophrenia in a different capacity, where like in law enforcement, sometimes I do interact with them. And I actually quite remember like 2 weeks ago, I had this opportunity to talk to this female, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she was inside a cell. And I was talking to her, and she mentioned how she was having ideas of how she's a teacher and she teaches Greek, and she has like students, and she's like, I'm not supposed to be here. Mind you, that's not her background at all. That has nothing to do with anything she's talking about. So my first impression was, okay, let me engage with this. Like what do you teach? What, like, how did you learn Greek? How did you get into this? And she started just telling me the story, and I spent maybe like 20 minutes just talking to her, just so I can calm her down a little bit, because she was a little bit high. And at the end of the interaction, she looked me in the eye, and she said, "You know what? Like, thank you so much, officer. Like, thank you very much. Like, within you spent these 5 minutes, and it really, really means something to me, and I really appreciate it." And I walked away, and I'm like, just those 10 minutes probably meant quite a lot to her, because I don't think anyone has ever acknowledged her reality as being truthful to some degree, right? And that acknowledgement sticks with people, and it could create change to some degree, right? Sometimes you might just see like schizophrenic individuals commit crimes because they don't really know what they're doing, and that is the reality. And the solution is not necessarily to grab them and throw them inside a jail cell, but rather um, talk to them in a manner. I don't blame anyone. It's just it was a very interesting observation about the aspect of acknowledging someone's reality and the influence it has. Yeah,
Yeah, that's amazing. That's
yeah.
amazing. It did sound like you had an impact there, and it's like, I mean, it must have been nice when she thanked you.
Yeah, it was really rewarding, man. It was like super rewarding. Like
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about this job as well. It's like I found it so rewarding. Like
100%.
it's so great when you can just touch somebody's soul, and like they like suddenly have hope again. Like they suddenly like realize like, okay, like maybe I can be set on the right track.
Hmm.
Or like when you just have like a good conversation with somebody and you feel that sense of connection, and like you feel like somebody feels like they've been heard, and that like they finally gotten something off their chest. And like I always I very frequently have interactions with clients where like, well, I'll compliment them on something that like, I mean, genuinely. So for example, that lady with schizophrenia, she used to be a heavy smoker and then she quit. Um, and I was like fascinated about it. I was like, what, really? You quit cigarettes? Like, that's such a hard thing to do. Like, you should really like give yourself a lot of credit, because like,
Mhm.
I deal with people who are smoking a lot and like they can't quit. Whereas like you, with all of your difficulties, like found a way to quit. Like, that's amazing. And like, very often you'll deal with people who've like never received a compliment, or like haven't received one in a while. And like, I just love seeing them light up when like finally like somebody sees something positive about them. And that's always such a great opportunity. But yeah, like even when I'm having a bad day, like if I have a session that day, it usually brings me back up, because it reminds me that like I'm doing like a really important work, and like that I'm making a difference. And so yeah, it's been so rewarding, and so like honestly so fun to be honest.
Yeah, 100%. Like I think whenever I meet someone new or something like that, I just love talking about therapy. That sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming for people as well, where like I'll be just ranting for hours about, like, it's quite fascinating for them a little bit. But it's like when you have a genuine passion for it, it's probably like I can't picture any job that's more rewarding than this. It's just like like you said, sometimes I'll have a terrible day and I'll go into the therapeutic room just like with a horrible mindset, just like, damn, like I hope I don't screw this up with the client, I hope I don't. And then the client, it's actually sometimes it's actually super creepy where like we'll do a session and the client will go through some issue and we solved it, and then that will help me solve my own issue, and I'm like, how fucking cool is that? You know what I mean? Or you just have this really rewarding feeling afterwards where you've given something to someone that is very hard to give, and it's you do need to be a little bit mindful because sometimes it does make you feel like it is this God complex to some degree when you attribute the notion of kind of healing to with yourself, where you have to kind of separate yourself as like it's not really you, it's more of like the therapy that's doing it, or the therapeutic room, or the essence of what you're talking about that's doing it. That really helps you kind of ground yourself, where I have seen therapists where they're a bit more overwhelmed and they're surprised that they themselves can do something, and they take on this role of kind of like a god figure within the therapeutic room, and I think that's a bit problematic.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, that is something that I've been dealing with, like feeling so overconfident after a
Hmm.
session,
Hmm.
where I'm like, "Fuck, man, I'm such a sick therapist. Like, I can heal anybody."
Yeah,
And
100%.
actually, one of the things, like, we had this in class, we had this like, honestly, the way the teacher went about it was a bit weird, but like we had this like we got into pairs, and then we discussed like what are the biggest challenges that we're dealing with as therapists. And I literally wrote, and I feel like such a dick for writing this. I wrote overconfidence as like my thing, whereas like the colleague who I was chatting with wrote imposter syndrome. So like
Hmm.
almost like the opposite. Um, but like yeah, I mean yeah, it has like I have noticed that it has inflated my ego. But one thing you said there was like really important to remind yourself, and one of the big lessons that I've taken away from my program is that like in the therapy room, the therapist is not the main character. Like they're more just like there to facilitate who the main character actually is, which is the client.
Hmm.
And so the way I treated it was like very similar to the relationship between the hero and like the wise wizard, or like the wise magic man. That's the way they often put it. Whereas like you're just there to kind of set that person on their journey, but you're not like a preacher to them. You're not like a god to them.
Yeah.
And sometimes they project that onto you, but you have to remind yourself that like no, the focus should be on the client. It should be client focused, and you should be there to kind of strengthen them and then set them off into the world a better person, rather than like assuming that like you're like almighty,
Hmm.
and having a big influence really. And a lot of the work happens outside of therapy. Like you get them kind of like on the right track, and then when they go into the real world, that's when the work really begins. And I've been noticing that with a lot of my clients, is like that's really when a lot of the positive change happens. And they'll come back to me and be like, yeah, like because of some of the things you told me, like I went about my life slightly differently, and like they actually put the lessons into practice, and then that's where the real change happened. And yeah. And there's something you said I wanted to pick up on. Shit, what was it? I should have wrote it down. Might have been related to like the idea of like uh, you not being the main character. I mean, do you have any additional thoughts? And then maybe I'll come
Yeah, I
back to
think I
mine.
think oh, immediately I was thinking about the Lion King. It's a very good example of it where Simba, like, he you remember like the monkey, the
Rafiki.
yeah, the guy with the staff, right? Like
Yeah.
he pops in just for the purpose of just a little bit of guidance, and then he just like fucks off afterward. He's like, bye. He doesn't really do anything. But the help is very needed, and the guidance is needed. You're like that. You're almost like a wand, or kind of just like a. You could think of yourself as kind of a little bit of like a guiding light. You just like come in, you like point out some things, maybe connect some patterns, give some insights that could be of use, right? And help the client kind of figure out their own path. I like the way you said it, where the client's on a kind of like a hero's journey, and you're just like the guiding figure for that. You're not really with the client with the sword right beside them. You're not doing all that, which is a very important thing to think about. And the overconfidence part, like I get that a lot as well, and it's a good it's a good reminder that I need to learn more. Like I always like when I get overconfident, I'm always like, okay, I need to learn more, right? Like I might just go watch videos, watch lectures, and then I feel stupid again, and then I'm like, oh, this is good, you know? So like
Nice.
this is a good place to be. Feel stupid again. Let me go back. You know, I might read like some sort of I might read like Jung or like a Piaget or something like that, and now I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about. You know? Okay, let me go do this again. It's a good
Right.
reminder to learn again, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And no, yeah, I've definitely been reminded, like, because every once in a while I'll encounter a situation, I'm like, I don't know about this that much. And like I really need to look into it and like start
hmm
doing
hmm
research. So you
hmm
start getting really heavy with the research. For example, oh man, I don't know if I should mention this. Oh man, okay. Well, okay. Hopefully this is the right thing to mention. I'm in a crazy situation with a couple of my clients. I don't know if I mentioned this last time.
No, you
I
haven't.
don't think I did. But basically, I have two clients, and it turns out, and I pieced it together very slowly.
hmm
They're dating each other, and they don't know
mm
that I'm the therapist for both of them.
mm.
So, and that's a crazy coincidence just on its own. Um, um, but so okay, I'll get back to what I was saying before. But basically, some relationship issues did come up, and it seemed really related to attachment theory. And I don't know that much about attachment theory, just the
Mm,
basics. And so I was like, I just mentioned it. I mentioned what I knew, and then I was like, okay, here are some other resources. Here are some other YouTube videos. Just check them out. And that client like did a deep dive into that subject and like got really into it, and started learning so much. And then he came back with these questions. And he was like, "What about avoidant relationships?" And I was like thinking about it. I was like, "I don't know shit about that."
yeah, I don't know what the fuck that is. Just like
Yeah. And so I was like, "Okay, you know what? Like I don't know too much about that, but I'll look into it for you."
yeah.
And so a lot of the times I'm having to go back and like do a whole bunch of other research just to get those extra skills,
hmm
just to get those extra perspectives. Um, because we both have like a Jungian orientation, or like the one that's one of the things we're very interested in. But Jung himself basically said, like a lot of people who like know this stuff very on a very surface level are like, is it Freud that's right? Is it Jung that's right? Is it Adler that's right? It's like Jung's opinion is that all three of them are right.
hmm
Jung
hmm
isn't like exclusionary like that. It's like my method or nothing. He recognizes that like if a different branch of psychology exists, it probably addresses some aspect of the human mind, because the human mind is such a complicated object organ that like it's probably legitimate that there's several different approaches that address different aspects of the mind.
hmm
And so that's why like we shouldn't ever shut down a modality and think this one's stupid, I'm just going to stick with this. And like what I want to do for future videos is actually kind of integrate Jung into a lot of these different things, definitely for CBT,
Yeah.
like a Jungian approach to CBT. And like one form of therapy that I've seen recently that I think has a lot of application is drama therapy or dramatic therapy.
hmm
I think that's actually related to the subject of my recent videos about masculinity,
hmm
and kind of like acting the part, because I think that like a lot of people can benefit from frankly from acting lessons.
Yeah.
Um, it can kind of show them who they could be if they were to act the part. Um, and so I kind of want to integrate these things together. But recently, I got the EFT textbook for my class. I didn't take the course because my program is kind of limited and I can't take that many courses. But I got the EFT textbook on Audible just to listen to it, just to take notes, and get all of that stuff down, because that's very helpful. Emotionally focused therapy, because you
hmm
don't see Jung talk about emotions too much, or at least not directly reference them, as far as I can tell. And so this kind of like addresses some of the shortcomings in his theory.
hmm
But I'm curious if you've ever had a chance to apply his theories. We talked about the shadow a little bit, but I'm curious about like dream analysis. Has that ever come up for any of your clients?
Yeah, I actually do. I do dream analysis with
Really?
probably almost all of my clients.
Wow.
I make it a point to do it just because
Wow.
I think the value of dreams is like it's so much, man. It's like dreams have a way, and some clients have never even conceptualized the idea that their dreams are even useful. They just think, I'm
Mhm.
like, why the hell is this guy talking about dreams, right? So I have to explain it to them. I've started recently asking clients about dreams at the end of a session. So like, pretend a session's like an hour. We'll do like 45 minutes to 50 minutes of just therapy, and then I'll ask. Well, I guess dream analysis is therapy as well, but in relation to I'll focus on the dream at the maybe like last 15 minutes, just because sometimes. I figure most of the time, if it's been a week and the client's addressing main issues within that week with the therapist, the dream itself has some sort of relationship to that problem as well, or like a core aspect of what they're talking about, which is quite interesting. And I've seen some interesting dreams where some dreams kind of predict future things, or some dreams warn clients about some of the things that they might need to change. And then some dreams are very accurate to exactly what I'm discussing with the client, right? For example, like I had a client the other day, and his dream was that his dream was that he was dreaming that he met one of his ex-girlfriends in a car on a street, and they were just having a casual conversation. And I was like, okay, tell me what you think about the dream. And he brought up the aspect that he was just saying random things, and he was telling me how, like I've always had girlfriends who were older than me, and in this dream, I felt like we were just equal partners. We were just having a casual conversation, and throughout my past relationships, I've never really felt like the dominant one, or I've never really felt like the leader. And I was like, that's exactly what the dream's telling you. Like you're at the process. And I asked him, like, how do you feel now? And he was telling me how, well, right now in my life, I feel like I could be the leader if I were to get into a relationship and so forth, right? And I was like, well, that's exactly what the dream is telling you. The dream is essentially telling you that perhaps it's time for you to look for a relationship, because you're at that psychological point in your life where you're able to have a relationship with the feminine, where it's either at an equal playing field, or you're able to play your masculine role to some degree. And he actually took a lot from that. He was like, "Holy shit, I didn't even think about that." I was like, "Well, that could be it. I could be completely wrong, but it seems like that could be it, right?" I also make it a point to ask the client what their interpretation of dream is. I'm of the mindset that I do think the therapist can interpret the dream. It could be of value to some degree, but if the client has some sort of interpretation themselves, I feel like incorporating that is probably very, very smart, and it often relates back to the dream in a more realistic and concrete way, and they kind of get it, right? There are some dreams where it's too much of an archetype kind of thing. It's too much of a like exploration of like symbolism or symbolic meanings of whether it be structures or ideas or animals and things like that, where I'm just like, okay, it's probably best we avoid this just for the purpose of kind of complexity. But there are some dreams where it's like it's quite useful, you know?
Interesting. Great job. Like
Yeah.
that's awesome that you're able to do that. Like I've been waiting for the opportunity for a dream or some for clients. I don't always make it a point that I do dream analysis, but
Yeah.
I have mentioned it to a couple clients. And some of them like they were straightforward enough that I was like, okay, that's basically just what we were talking about before. Like you have you're working with somebody and you're scared about your relationship with them, you're scared about getting fired, like simple stuff that we'd already discussed that was just
Hmm.
kind of manifesting in the dream. But it's a really great example, and like I feel kind of inspired to like maybe do it more because I always feel like I feel like yeah, dreams are very messy. And so I don't know if everybody would be receptive to like
Hmm.
dream
Hmm.
analysis
Hmm.
because it might be like, what's the point? Like, it's just a bunch of random crap. Like, I saw SpongeBob in my dream. Like, you're gonna tell me that's meaningful? Like, but yeah, but if hearing that you've been able to use it successfully and very successfully, like that's pretty encouraging. It makes me feel like it would be a good idea to offer it more and to see because I feel like I have to take my time with analysis. Like I can't do it in the session. Like if somebody tells
Yeah.
me a dream, like give me a day. Like I gotta like think about this.
Give me
Like
the.
yeah, at least a day. And I've noticed that when I did dream analysis for people in the past, that like I couldn't come up with anything on the moment. I had to be like in the right state of mind
Yeah.
where my brain would just. It's almost like I had to be kind of dreamlike, where my brain would just spontaneously come up with an interpretation.
Hmm.
And then I could go back and be like, okay, this is what I think. So I think I'll try to make it a policy that like if you want dream analysis, give me the dream, give me a day, or give me like until the next session, and then I'll tell you what I think.
Hmm.
But I like what you said as well that like you ask the client to formulate their own opinion or their own interpretation, because that's really the key part, that they come away with an interpretation that makes sense to them, that makes sense to like given their situation, and they would probably be the best interpreter because they have all the context of their life to incorporate into the interpretation and bring that, and so that they would be able to make the most sense out of it, whereas the analyst kind of just helps them structure that and helps them analyze it, and then maybe like brings up some archetypal themes that might be of use to the client. And that actually reminds me of one client that I was working with. And this is not about dreams, but it was a very interesting case of her brain spontaneously producing archetypal imagery, or kind of related to archetypal imagery. But basically, for context, she's an atheist, so that this makes it even more interesting. But we were talking about morality because we were doing existential work, and we're talking about like where does she get her sense of morality, and where do you think morality comes from, and like what's the point of it? Because she's like very worried about the state of the world, and like I was trying to like help kind of stabilize her sense of self. And she thought about it, and she was like, well, I think the fact that we're conscious and like consciously aware of things puts us at like in a special place morally. Like we're aware of the suffering of others, and so that makes us that kind of like puts a moral burden on us. And I was like, oh, interesting. Where did you get that idea? And she was like, where did I get what idea? I was like, what you just said. She was like, I just came up with it. And I was like, oh, okay, that's like really smart of you to just like come up with that spontaneously, because it is basically just like literally the story of Adam and Eve being told again, but like her mind just spontaneously came up with it. And like in that moment I was surprised, but later I thought about it, I was like, I shouldn't have been surprised at all, because like it is archetypal, like her brain would come up with that notion. Like and I did explain like the story of Adam and Eve, and I explained it symbolically, because I was like, listen, like don't think of like this as being like, I know, a true account of how humans originated. Think of this as like symbolic. But then I went over the story, and she was like, oh yeah, that is like basically the same thing. But again, I shouldn't have been surprised that her brain would spontaneously generate that imagery, because it does. Like these are archetypal for a reason. They exist in all people. And so it shouldn't be that surprising when our brains spontaneously generate archetypal imagery.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's such a unique experience too, just to have that, and to reflect back on it afterwards, like how the hell did that come into your brain? I was like, oh, this is how it came out. That's actually super interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's going back to dream, like you mentioned, I think it's the primary importance is placed on the client, right? And their interpretation of the dream. Like the interpretation doesn't necessarily just come out of nowhere. If they have some sort of connection to the dream, the connections are made in their mind through their experiences. So like it's a little bit more valid to that point, right? And I'm of the mindset, like I tend to encourage that as well. Especially dream analysis in itself, it's almost like you could do it for the purpose of perhaps finding something new, but you can also do it for the purpose of kind of opening the client up to more of a spiritual kind of analysis of their psyche, or looking at the world in a different way where that could be of importance to them, right? Sometimes I get clients, this is one of the biggest issues I have with clients. I've had it with multiple clients where um, rationality is problematic sometimes. It's good for conducting your life in modern day, but it could be problematic in relation to your interactions with others, right? Like I have a client right now. He's a very logical person. He kind of takes steps, and he's an engineer too, which makes sense. But like he takes very concrete steps about how he analyzes interactions and things like that. And my kind of goal is to integrate this, perhaps the spiritual nature to him, which is focusing on his emotional aspects, or rather how he feels, rather than a logical kind of explanation of everything around him, which is, I think dream analysis kind of it introduces the person. Like there's a different side of you, which is actually very unique, and you should explore it, you know?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And
Yeah.
I totally agree when you say that rationality can be problematic. I have a video like the problem with rationality. And I don't know if have you read The Master and His Emissary yet, or
No, I haven't.
okay. Well, that's the big book about like the two brain hemispheres and how they're different, and
I'm aware
like
of the concept. I'm aware of the concept. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and he's like talking about how the left hemisphere is like overly rational, and
Hmm.
like that might give people the impression of like being really smart, but it actually means almost like the opposite. It means like very decontextualized, very like unable to like grasp the whole, very like closed in a box. So like rationality is always based on like you believe certain principles, and then you use those principles to extrapolate more information.
Hmm.
But what if the principles at the start are flawed or limited, or like don't apply in a certain context. So it can actually very limit your thinking. And like people get convinced that like rationality is everything. We need to be rational, but really like we need to not be so rational all the time. Like,
Mhm.
and one of the biggest like traits associated with autism is like hyper rationality, and hyper like being like, hyper obsessed with logic and everything being logically consistent. Like the universe is not logically consistent. Like it just isn't.
Mhm.
Like it just always keeps presenting us with things that are beyond logic. And so I like the fact that like you can integrate that spiritual side of things by looking at dreams and by taking dreams seriously. And I was wondering, was that client like receptive to the idea, or was there any resistance, or what?
In relation to like bringing up dreams.
Yeah.
Um, he was actually quite. He wasn't too receptive to it. I think. I do think it does depend on the person as well. Sometimes clients aren't receptive to the idea, but they can. You can always implement spirituality in a different way. Like he's also Muslim as well, and
Mm-hmm.
we had one time we had a entire conversation about his relationship with Islam and so far, and that was a really good motivator to kind of integrate him back into it and get a little bit of idea of his spiritual side, which was helpful in relation to evoking some more emotional reactions, right? But he did have the tendency to rationally analyze the Quran to some degree,
Right.
right? And that was a little bit more it was interesting how his personality even took over the spiritual like spiritual text and it was rationalizing it rather than kind of like ingraining it emotionally, which was
Mm-hmm.
which was interesting. So there's a little bit of work to be done there, but we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So in
Yeah.
I mean that regard, I definitely recommend the book.
Mhm.
Actually, I think I could send you like the audiobook because I think somebody put it in our. Oh no, it's in the Discord server. Somebody like put the whole audio thing of the book there, and I recommend checking it out because it does go
Yeah.
into that a lot. It goes into like the problem with rationality. Give me one sec. My dog wants to escape.
Oh, no problem. Take your time. Yeah.
Go, 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 go. But like I was saying,
Hmm.
it explains like what the issue with hyperrationality is, and it kind of frames it as like this could kill us, this could destroy us, and you can see a lot of the consequences of like our hyperrational age like manifesting now. This was written like 10 years ago, and now I regret putting him outside because now he's barking. Teddy. All right. Well, but yeah, I really recommend it. And one of the lessons that it taught me is like how language, how communication is. There's so much unconscious, nonverbal stuff going on in communication. So
Hmm.
like whenever we talk, like it's not just the words that I'm using. It's really like my tone of voice and like what I emphasize and like my body language as well. All of that is like so important in communication. And I think learning that early on has contributed a lot to me being a good therapist because it allowed me to think not just in terms of the words that I was speaking, but the way I was delivering them, like the
Hmm.
cadence,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
the prosody, like all of that is being crucial to effective communication. And I think that's like one of the reasons that I can communicate with people and get on their level without just like throwing jargon at them.
Hmm.
And then like they can even understand the things that I'm saying when they don't even understand the individual words, just because like there's that kind of like unconscious communicative aspect. And so it's very helpful in that regard. I really recommend it.
Yeah, for sure. I 100% agree with that. I think there's two ways you can learn that. Like it seems like you learned it from kind of knowledge to some degree, right? Like learning
Mhm.
it and then applying it and so forth. I think I've learned it through experience to some degree. I don't even know. I never even read the book. I understand the concept a little bit. I've heard it before. I've also watched the video on it too. That was very
Mhm.
helpful. Um, but I think I learned it from experience where sometimes you do like going back to the conversation about temperament, I think I'm temperamentally a little bit open to some degree, like openness as a trait, and I am a bit sensitive to emotion to some degree. Even though I kind of hold it back, I'm not too emotionally reactive, but I am sensitive to emotion. So I think from a young age, I've been able to, since I'm sensitive, I know how to interact emotionally or with my tone to other individuals because I don't want to feel the same, right? So
Mhm.
that's been very effective, and I think that has had quite a big difference in what type of therapist I am and how effective
Mhm.
I am. Like, right, even in like tone, like that's so important. Tone, body language, the way you say things, the choices in words are very important. I had a client one. This is a great example. I had a client one time. He was um he had I think a 7 or 10 year relationship with his significant other, and he was going through a lot of stuff emotionally. Their relationship wasn't too great, and he ended up seeing a different woman and as he was saying these things and he was telling me, and I brought up the word affair, and he didn't conceptualize it as an affair till I said the word, and his reaction to that was like completely different. He's like, and then he came back the next week and he told me, he's like, like I didn't really think it was an affair, but when you use that word, and I went back home and sat down and thought about it, I realized that was actually an affair. Like even my interaction with that female was an affair, and I felt so much guilt. I felt so much like, I was in a depressive state, and then he thanked me for using it. It was more of like a reality check for him.
Mm.
So it just reminded me, like even choices in words, like sometimes the client might not be comprehending certain things. It just depends on the words that you use, which really impacts them, right?
Hmm.
It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I've always tried to go the route of using simpler language,
Yeah.
using like words that that anybody can understand rather than like using technical terms. But I have noticed that like me using metaphors is really important. And the book
Hmm.
also talks about metaphor a lot. And I had this. I presented this in class. Where I use this metaphor, so a lot of dealing with a lot of people with intrusive thoughts, which is pretty common, or like anxiety producing thoughts. The way I talk about it is like you can think of your thoughts as like a train, and you can either choose to get on that train or just let it pass. Now, even if you do get on the train, you don't have to stay on the train. You can get off at the next station. And so I try to use a lot of metaphors to kind of convey these concepts, and that usually gets the idea across because metaphors are very important. I think that metaphors are like actually how consciousness functions.
Hmm.
It functions through metaphor, through like a metaphorical relationship between the object and the thing being used to describe it. And so there's even like I think there's like a type of therapy. There's so many types of therapy, but I think there's one based on metaphor specifically, like using like metaphors to help bring about understanding.
Yeah.
And I completely endorse that. I think that makes perfect sense to me. And so yeah, I mean, whenever I try to convey something difficult, like I'll try to implement some kind of metaphor that's related to it, to kind of get that across. And I've also been, I don't know if this exists as a form of therapy. It probably should. I mean, it probably does, but in case it doesn't, I'll be the first to found it. Which is like the idea of vocabulary metaphor, vocabulary therapy. That a
Hmm.
lot of the time we don't even have the vocabulary to describe our experiences or to describe like what's going on with us. And so equipping people with that vocabulary, I think, can be like therapeutic because it then draws their attention to that. Like words are kind of like a filter over reality, and there's good things about that, and there's bad things. Um, but the good thing is that it then draws our attention to different parts of the world, and allows us to see them slightly differently because now
Hmm.
we have a word for it. It's like now you can recognize when that thing is happening. So I think, for example, the attachment style thing with that client, he didn't have the word avoidant. He didn't have the word like anxious attachment style. But now that he has those concepts, and he can probably recognize patterns in himself and in his girlfriend, whenever she's doing something that's like anxious related or whenever he's doing something avoidant, and then recognize it and be like, okay, that's like a consequence of my attachment style. So I think that vocabulary is very, very important. I think that metaphor is very important. And I think it's still a new field. And so there's still so much to explore, still so much theories that can be applied. And hopefully I get to learn more and more as I keep going.
Yeah, 100%. I think like I completely agree with the metaphor aspect. Even like one of the biggest things about metaphor is like religious teachings, right? Like from the
Mm.
dawn of time, it's used the metaphor to convey very deep ethical and like moral dilemmas. And there's a purpose for that because it sticks on a lot faster, right? If you see any kind of priest preaching or something like that, there's always a metaphor ingrained in it. And you're addressing a community as well, which is super interesting because you're using the metaphor to almost like bring in the community into the story, and you're kind of taking them on a journey with the metaphor, and it's almost like mass psychosis to some degree.
Mhm.
It's super interesting. Yeah, I think I'm double for that metaphor thing. That's
Mm.
I haven't really, I don't know, I haven't really used much metaphors. I think I've used it
Mhm.
maybe a few times. I might actually think about using it a little bit more. I do think
Mhm.
it's a better way to connect with someone. And you mentioned about like the development of consciousness through metaphors. I think that's yeah, that's an interesting concept.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely try to use the train one because I'm sure you deal with people who have thoughts that are distressing or like they can't let go
Yeah.
of them and they
Yeah. Yeah.
overthink. So that thought one is a good one. It's a good one for mindfulness as well.
Hmm.
I don't know how much to what extent you incorporate mindfulness, but I took a course on it. Course itself. as I mentioned, I think the last time, pretty bad. Not a great course, not well taught, kind of like very impromptu. But the lessons were really useful, ended up being really useful. Surprisingly, like I end up eventually using mindfulness with all of my clients so far, and like really great results. Like it calms them down. Sometimes they get like really euphoric from it, which is surprising because it's supposed to calm you down. They use it as a way, like some people with anxiety, they use it as a way to quickly snap out of their anxiety, like the way to breathe properly and to slow it down. Like I had one guy who he used to deal with his okay, so in like a particular situation, he dealt with his anxiety by smoking like 8 cigarettes in a row, and I was like, dude, that's not going to cut it. We need to think of something else. And so I taught him some like mindfulness breathing exercises, and that's what he's been relying on. That like whenever he has those anxious thoughts, he just snaps into that breathing mode, slowing things down, and eventually the anxiety goes away.
Well, what is the, sorry to interrupt you. What is
Yeah.
the, can you tell me what the exercise was? I think people love to hear that, you know?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the exercise that I showed him was basically this body scan where I asked him to close his eyes. So this was in session. And then I'm going to direct his consciousness to different parts of his body. And I gave an explanation of consciousness. Like, what do I mean by consciousness? Your awareness specifically. And then I asked him, like, so for example, first, you're going to put your awareness on your toes. And then whenever you shift awareness, you're going to breathe in very slowly. So in through the nose, out through the mouth, very slowly, to the point where you can kind of hear the wind as it passes through your nose and your mouth. And you don't have to breathe out through the mouth. You can breathe out through the nose, but really important to breathe in through the nose, and just slow it down. The reason you slow it down is because whenever you're anxious, your breathing increases, so you'll start to breathe faster. And so if you breathe slower, it's like a physiological indication to your body that like things have calmed down. There's nothing to worry about. Just take it easy. So I shifted his awareness. I'd be like, move your awareness to your knees, breathe in, breathe out. Move your awareness to your lap, breathe in, breathe out. And then I would shift his awareness all over his body, finally ending up at the forehead, like the third eye. That'll be the last point. Breathe in, breathe out very slowly, very calmly. And then I would ask him to open his eyes. And he reacted to that like super calm. He felt like that was so calming, so relieving. It put so many thoughts out of his mind that he would normally have, because it's really training your awareness to fixate on something specific rather than your thoughts. So like your brain, your awareness can go to your thoughts. You can get attached to your thoughts, but it's really training the mind to go back, to reclaim your kind of control and move your attention to something more relevant, something more helpful, rather than being stuck on those thoughts. So yeah, I do that with like every client. They like it a lot. Another one that I do is like 16-8 breathing, a little bit more advanced, but I like it a lot. Where basically you breathe in very slowly until your lungs are full, and then you hold your breath for 16 seconds, and then you let it all out until your lungs are empty, and then you hold that for 8 seconds. And then repeat for like a minute. You can do it for longer. Like my mom, my sister, and I used to do it together, and we did this for like 5 minutes. And it's a little bit hard, actually, if you're not used to holding your breath, especially when your lungs are empty. Like it can be very like hard to hold on to that, and like you can gasp. But if you can do it, it's very calming. It's very like it puts you into like that Zen state of mind where it just feels like everything's chill, everything's relaxed. And like I always I try to integrate Buddhism, some concepts from Buddhism, into a lot of these discussions, because I do notice the Buddha was right that like craving is the source of suffering. So for example, like that client who's dealing with addiction, like I told them that like the fact that you're craving porn all the time is like the source of your suffering. So if you can get to a state where you don't feel any cravings at all, it'll be really beneficial. And so the meditation I taught him, specifically related to the mandala, which is why I have it up, it's really simple. Just sit in a cross-legged position and then just stare at the center of the mandala. Just stare at the center. You blink, obviously, because you don't want to just like, your eyes to go dry, but just keep, anytime your eyes wander, just bring it back to the center and just keep that in focus. I don't know if you've ever done this, but it's really interesting what happens, especially with a cool pattern like that. First of all, the pattern itself, it starts to like not change color, but just look different. Like it starts to like have this different like whenever you stare at anything for too long, your eyes get tired, and it's kind of like you need to reset. So if you don't allow it to reset, it kind of like blurs and it kind of fades into the background. And then everything in your peripheral vision will also start to fade. So you'll be in a room that's completely lit, yet it looks entirely dark. So it's really cool actually what happens. I don't know if you have you ever tried that or ever like tried a meditation where you just stare at one thing.
I have it. I've tried it a long time ago though. It was
Did that
interesting.
happen?
That did happen, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think your focus goes to the center. It's actually quite hard. Like people think I used to do some crazy stuff. I used to like sit and stare at a wall for like try as long
Mhm.
as I can. And it's very but that was more of a kind of like an active imagination kind of practice. It was more of like
Oh, okay.
just to see like what are the thoughts that are coming up? Is there anyone who's talked like any entities or something like that? And that's quite
Mhm.
hard as well. That's also a meditative exercise too, but it's a little bit more scary just in case like I mean like your shadow side will come up a little bit more in relation
Mm.
to that. But I have tried that a long time ago. It was very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I recommend trying it again,
Yeah.
especially with because I got this in India,
Hmm.
when I was in the Himalayas, and like I've been using it to do that meditation. And there's a few different things you can actually do with it. Like there's a meditation where you stare at it for a while, and then you close your eyes, and then you'll see the after image, and you just want to stare at the after image and like hold on to it. And that's like a way to like again like keep your mind fixated on one thing and not let it wander.
Hmm.
But like yeah, so many benefits to this, so many different like things you can apply. And I think it's really just about like getting people to be calm, to not listen to their anxiety, or to like deal with their anxiety in a way that just gets rid of it very quickly.
Hmm.
So surprisingly helpful. Like, and the thing is, it's interesting how like my clients seem to be benefiting it from it more than I am. Like, I do mindfulness pretty regular, well, not super regularly, like decently, and I don't benefit from it that much. But my clients have been like, "This is amazing! Like, this is like so helpful," and I've been like, "Dude, that's awesome!" Like, I didn't even know it would be that helpful, but like,
Hmm.
I'm glad that it is.
Yeah, that's something perhaps like I haven't really looked too deep into mindfulness. I am aware of it. I have used breathing techniques, but it was more of an understanding of like physiological calmness, like just calming your physiology down. I think that was more of an understanding. I do need to like I think I'll look into it a little bit more to be honest. Was the
Mhm.
course helpful in relation to some of the things that it was talking about? How was the course like?
Yeah, it was so the helpful parts of the course were like how to introduce a mindfulness practice, like
Yeah.
the you because I'm pretty like hyped up when I talk, so I try to like calm down right before I do it to get into like that more meditative state of mind. We did practice like doing mindfulness exercises with each other, and this is kind of funny. I did one with my friend. It was a visualization, so I asked him to close his eyes and like visualize a beach, and then we went through the whole thing. And then he opens his eyes and he's like, "Oh, by the way, I have aphantasia." And I was like, why didn't you tell me? We just did this whole thing,
What
and you
what is
can't even.
aphantasia? What is that?
It's when you don't have a mind's eye, you can't produce mental images.
Oh, okay.
Like
Interesting.
if I ask you to close your eyes and like imagine an elephant, like you just can't. Like it just won't
Why
happen.
did he not tell you that before? That's
I
crazy.
know, right? Like what?
He just like faked the whole thing and then came back like, yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't even do it.
he just sat there with his eyes closed, and then later was like, "By the way, I didn't do anything."
Oh,
Like,
that's so
but
funny, man.
yeah, like it helped us. It gave me a few different practices to implement, so I have them like written down the scripts.
Hmm.
The textbooks were really good. I can send those to you as well.
Yeah.
They have like a whole bunch of different mindfulness techniques. They're really simple. That's the thing. They're very simple. It's just like gratitude. It's just like reflecting on like the present moment. It's really about being in the present moment, not thinking about the past, not
Yeah.
worrying about the future. It's about being in the here and now.
Yeah.
But they're really simple, really straightforward. I prefer the ones that are a bit more advanced because that's where you can really feel an effect. Um, but yeah, I can send that to you. And like, yeah, so some those lessons were really helpful, like how to talk about mindfulness in sessions, how to run somebody through a set like a an exercise. I noticed whenever I do it, like I become because I kind of also do it at the same time. I become like very zen and like I
Hmm.
start
Hmm.
talking
Hmm.
quieter and like slower. And like and then I have to like kind of bring myself back into therapy mode. Um,
Yeah, 100%.
um,
I think when I've done it, it has been like you do take on kind of a different personality right as you start it. You're more like my voice changes, my tone of voice changes as well.
mhm,
It's like just to calm the person down. I think you're taking on a role, yes, for sure. I do think it's quite helpful to do that. And then also on the simplicity of mindfulness, I do agree. I there have been you do have to. I read this somewhere a while ago. I think I was watching video, reading about a psychiatrist. He was talking about how like the aspect of mindfulness and giving techniques, sometimes the difficulty is depending on the client, right? Like sometimes a client's mind or their thought process is so advanced and so super fast that simple mind techniques like breathing techniques don't really work. So I have had I think I remember one client where that was the case and I told him to kind of like it was a breathing technique. It was like a very simple, I think like four and fours. It was just a breathing technique. And then I told him to stand on one leg while he's doing it because it was so complex that like just sitting down and breathing is like the thought is not the thoughts are still there, right? So if you're balancing yourself, there's kind of like your awareness. It's more like you said, just directing awareness from the thought to something else. So he's aware of his balance as well as the breathing. So that was a little bit more. That was a little bit better for him. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Standing on one leg. I mean, that's yeah, definitely a way to like make it so that only the present moment exists
Exactly.
because you
Exactly.
have to focus on that. Yeah,
Yeah. 100%.
yeah, I like that. That's a good suggestion. That like maybe like when people are like their thinking is more advanced, that like I can complexify it by giving them more for their body to do to be occupied with, so that like their thoughts don't run wild.
Yeah. That's also
But
like
yeah.
kind of the basics of yoga as well. Like there's yogic
Mhm.
teachings where the teachings are relevant to individuals, but there's also complex teachings for like say like saints or like, yogis and things like that. And that's there for a reason because like their mind is so used to that like simple things aren't really going to like help them in a manner that's effective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been doing yoga every morning. Well, I haven't done it like the past couple of mornings because
Hmm.
things have been slightly off, but I've been trying to make that a practice, and that's been like very beneficial. Like I think also just like the fact that you're connecting with your body, like it makes you feel like you have a body. Because I'm like somebody who's always in my mind, and then like this reminds me like no, I'm not just my mind. I'm also my body as well. And I try to recommend it to clients whenever like if they can do it, if like it's something that they're interested in. That like I profess that there's a lot of benefits to it. So yeah.
There is, I completely agree with you. Like I was talking to a friend the other day about this and like they thought I was crazy, but I was telling her how I sometimes I'm in the shower and I don't realize that the water is actually hitting my body, and it's just like I think sometimes you're just in the motion of everyday life that you kind of do things without necessarily understanding it, right? Like or just looking at your
Mm,
hand and realizing like this is something that like I can actually move it. It's quite interesting just to be aware of it because it gives you a different perspective of what it actually is. Even just water falling on you, just being aware of the water falling on you, it's quite different. It gives you a different perspective of your daily routine, which is very important.
mm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That
Yeah.
kind of reminded me for a sec of Heidegger. He has this concept of like Vorhandenheit, which basically means like when you're going with the flow of things, like it feels very natural, but then like suddenly you have this moment of awareness when like your for example your hand like appears to you as like almost like a foreign object, but more like a thing. Like whoa, wait a second, I have a hand.
Hmm.
So like
Hmm.
he distinguishes between like that like very natural state and like that very kind of like alienated state of like realizing that you have something. But yeah, that's interesting.
100%.
Okay, so I think I gotta go soon.
Yeah, I think we had
So
we had a long conversation.
yeah, I think that was awesome and learned a lot. And I think that was really great to hear, especially about the fact that you use dream analysis a lot.
Yeah.
And I'll definitely try to incorporate that more. But yeah, do you have any final thoughts, or should we just end it now?
No, I think we can. I know. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I think we're definitely going to continue this, so it's going to be really really
Yeah.
good, perhaps. All right. And looking forward to it. I think it's super nice just talking and reflecting about some of the things that I'm doing because I learn a lot too, just from some of the things that you're telling me, as also reflecting back on my own thoughts. It's quite.
Mhm.
It's very it's a privilege. It's so thank you.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, no, and I learned a lot too. It's really great to talk to somebody who's experienced with that and has a lot of experience to tell me about. And I absolutely learned a lot, and I've taken away a lot that I definitely hope to incorporate into future sessions with therapy. So yeah, thank you so much.
100%. I'll yeah.